Good morning. Welcome to yet another Foul First Thursday. That's our Friends of the Waccamaw Library, our wonderful friends group that makes this and so many other programs possible, our adult programs, our children's programs, our teen programs, and really help support us financially, but also with volunteer work, have our Friends Center going, and our online Friends Center right now. So we thank them, our president, Diane Stern, Mr. Otto, our treasurer, and all our wonderful folks in our Friends organization. If you're not a friend of the Waccamaw Library, please join up and help out and share your talents with us. So today we have a very special guest and a very special topic to help kick off our holiday season this December 3rd. This is Dr. Marjorie J. Spruill, and she's going to talk about South Carolina women and the right to vote, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment in South Carolina. And Marjorie is Distinguished Professor Emerita of History at the University of South Carolina, and Dr. Spruill is the author of 3 books about women's history, including New Women of the New South, the leaders of the Woman Suffrage Movement in the Southern states, and she is editor of One Woman, One Vote, the companion to the PBS documentary series about the movement for women's voting rights. There's volume 2, I must say, of One Woman, One Vote that will be published on March 9th, 2021. So that's right around the corner coming out. And Dr. Spruill also has available for sale copies of Volume 1 if you're interested in that. And you can contact me if you'd like to get in touch with Dr. Spruill for copies of that at dturner@gtcounty.org. Dr. Spruill has degrees from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Duke University, and the University of Virginia. She taught previously at Vanderbilt University. She is a leading expert on the woman suffrage movement and a prominent historian of the American South. And she's also married to Don Doyle, who is a prominent historian of the American South as well. So they are indeed an intellectual power couple. So we are thrilled to have her joining us today. She's the real deal, and this is quite a thrill. So Dr. Marjorie Spruill, and I must add as a personal note, she also was on my wife, Dr. Keegan Turner's dissertation committee, so that's a great personal honor. But thank you so much for joining us today from beautiful Folly Beach, South Carolina, where you are wonderfully retired after a great career, although you're still working, thankfully, for the rest of us. Not officially, but still doing scholarship and doing all these wonderful talks.
Yes, this year, particularly because it's the centennial of the 19th Amendment, I've been super busy and learning a lot about technology I didn't expect to ever learn, and working on this new volume, the updated, expanded volume of the One Woman, One Vote book, and it's so definitely keeping busy, but you know, that's a good thing right now. I'm never bored, I'll tell you.
There are worse places to be than Folly Beach, beautiful spot in beautiful South Carolina. So, and we really are thrilled and honored to have you and one of the leading experts around to talk about, as we said, you know, one of the crucial topics in the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and you are, you know, a superstar historian to talk about that. So thank you for joining us.
You're very kind. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. I am, as Daniel said, going to talk to you about the 19th Amendment and about the long road to getting it and the role of South Carolina women in that. As you know, it was ratified 100 years ago, and I'm going to try to put my slides up right now. So that's working. All right. So the long road to the 19th Amendment. You know, women have been voting now for 100 years. We just did a lot of voting recently. The women's vote did not immediately turn out to be larger than men. It took many decades for that to happen, but women have been voting at an even higher rate than men now for several decades. And our votes are much sought after by many, feared by others, but at any rate, lots of attention given now to women voters. But, you know, 100 years ago, we were just getting that right. So I'm going to dip back in history now and talk to you about this long road to 19th Amendment, maybe more than you even want to know, bear with me, and to see how generations of suffragists won that right for us that we now so proudly exercise. The Woman Suffrage Movement began in the northeastern United States in the context of antebellum reform. Many women began speaking about women's rights when their efforts to participate in the great reform movements of that era, most notably the movement to end slavery, were severely criticized as inappropriate for their sex. You may know Sarah and Angelina Grimke of South Carolina, born here in Charleston, were among the first to raise the issue, and they did so after being severely criticized for speaking against slavery in public. The Grimke sisters are some of my favorite historical characters. They were from a prominent slaveholding family, but left their privileged existence to move north and live among the Quakers because of their opposition to slavery. And when their lectures began to attract huge audiences that included men very curious about these strange creatures who were from a slaveholding family speaking out against slavery, the Grimke sisters encountered tremendous criticism, including from congregational ministers of Massachusetts who denounced them formally for assuming, quote, the place and tone of man as public reformer, unquote, and barred them from speaking in all the congregational churches. Angelina also attracted a lot of attention, both positive and negative, in 1836 when she published this appeal to the Christian women of the South, seeking to persuade and push Southern women to act against slavery. But it was publicly burned in the customs house, outside the customs house in Charleston, and their mother was warned that the sisters would be arrested if they ever returned to the city. Both sisters wrote on women's rights. In 1837, Sarah Grimke published Letters on the Equality of the Sexes. We've been hearing some quotes from that recently, from which the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg quoted even in her first Supreme Court case, Frontiero versus Richardson. I ask no favors for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright. By the way, the home where the sisters grew up still exists. It is a law office on East Bay Street. Many people in Charleston first became aware of the sisters back when Sue Monk Kidd published her very popular book, The Invention of Wings, that is based on their story. And by the way, I can't resist showing you one of my favorite photos. This is one of me with these 4 8th grade girls who had interviewed me a couple of months before for their History Day project on the Grimkes, for which they obviously won first place, and they were there that day. The women who set the women's rights movement in action by calling for the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, also ran into difficulties participating in the anti-slavery movement. They first met in London, where they had gone for a world anti-slavery convention, only to find that women were excluded from the proceedings. In 1848, they put out the call for the conference in Seneca Falls, New York, where Stanton was then living, and there the participants voted to demand the vote, the first formal demand for woman suffrage. It was part of a declaration of sentiments, they called it, demanding a wide range of reforms, ranging from married women's property rights to the rights to equal education and employment, and also to freedom from domestic violence. Interestingly, some of the participants thought that asking for woman suffrage was just too radical, and it was only after powerful urging by both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and former slave and famous anti-slavery orator Frederick Douglass that they were convinced to include it. But even then, many refused to sign. Two other women who became prominent leaders of the woman suffrage movement, Susan B. Anthony in this rare photo of her as a young woman that you see here, and Lucy Stone, they were not at Seneca Falls, but they quickly became involved. From the beginning, the women's movement was an interracial movement. Sojourner Truth, who had escaped from slavery in New York, became one of the star orators of the women's rights and anti-slavery movements, both best known for her speech, Ain't I a Woman? Unlike Sojourner Truth, most of the African-American women who were active in the women's movement in these years were middle-class women who had been born free in the North, including Sarah Remond, Harriet Purvis, Frances Harper. During the war, white and black women's rights advocates focused on making it a war to free the slaves. They formed the Women's National Loyal League, through which they gathered signatures on petitions calling for a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. And after the war, the women's movement began to focus more and more on gaining the vote, but not just for themselves. Their goal was universal suffrage for all. Though the Constitution had left decisions about requirements for voting to the states, during Reconstruction there was a lot of talk about amending the Constitution to enfranchise newly emancipated African Americans so that they had the power to protect themselves. It was also important to the Republicans who were controlling Congress to have some people in the South who would vote for them, and thus they would be able to continue to hold power in Congress and complete their plans for Reconstruction. The 14th Amendment, of course, declared African Americans to be citizens and with the right to vote. The 15th reiterated that their vote was protected, but nowhere in either amendment were women's right to vote recognized or protected. In fact, the enforcement clause of the 14th Amendment, declaring that states would lose part of their representation in Congress if they denied male citizens the vote on account of race, that was the first time that the word male had ever appeared in the Constitution. The Founding Fathers spoke of persons and people, but not male and female. With racial prejudice so strong in the North and the West, as well as in the South, advocates for these two amendments knew that it was going to be hard to get the requisite number of states, 3/4 of the states, to extend the vote to black men. Adding woman suffrage, most of the men concluded, would make that impossible. Even Frederick Douglass begged them to understand. It was, they said, the Negro's hour. The woman's hour, they said, would come at a later date. The suffragists were very, very upset about this, and the issue of how to respond actually tore the women's movement apart. In 1869, they divided into two factions over whether or not to support ratification of the 15th Amendment and how to go about getting the vote. The National, under Anthony and Stanton, refusing to support it. The American, led by Lucy Stone and her husband Henry Blackwell, also upset about this, but nonetheless supporting ratification. As Lucy Stone said, at least somebody would get out of this terrible pit of disfranchisement. Naturally, the American Woman Suffrage Association attracted larger numbers of African American affiliates, and that included the Rollin sisters of South Carolina, who were some of the few women in the South who openly worked for woman suffrage in these years. We only had the photo of one of them, the oldest one, Frances Rollin, who then married Whipper. They were descendants of emigres who had fled Saint-Domingue Revolution in the late 18th century, and the Rollins were free people of color who were living prosperously in South Carolina during the era of slavery. And before the Civil War, the sisters lived in Charleston with their parents, William and Margaretta Rollin. Their father was a devout Catholic who operated a prosperous lumber business, and the girls attended private Catholic schools in Charleston. The three oldest girls were sent to the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia for secondary education. During Reconstruction, the Rollin sisters lived in Columbia, where they were strong supporters of women's suffrage and well situated to promote it. Charlotte, Catherine, and Louisa Rollin turned their home, which was right next to the state capitol building, into a salon where movers and shakers in Reconstruction-era South Carolina politics would gather. Frances married a state legislator, as I said, William Whipper, who promoted women's suffrage as a delegate to the 1868 South Carolina Constitutional Convention. In 1869, Charlotte, known by the name Lottie Rollin, addressed the state legislature on behalf of women's suffrage, insisting that public opinion has had a tendency to limit women's sphere to too small a circle, those are her words, and asking for suffrage, quote, not as a favor, not as a privilege, but as a right. In 1870, the Rollins held a women's rights convention in Columbia, attended by some of the state's most influential male Republicans, black and white. And with Lucy Stone's encouragement, in 1871, the sisters established a state suffrage organization affiliated with the American Woman Suffrage Association, in which Lottie Rollin represented South Carolina as an ex officio member of their executive committee. And I want to add here that if you'd like to know more about them, Volume 2 of our book, South Carolina Women, Their Lives and Times, which is readily available through your bookstores or Amazon, has a wonderful article about them. And also I've been working with Beryl Dakers of South Carolina Educational Television on a documentary on the Rollins that, but for COVID, would have been on last week, and she assures me is in the final stages, so look for that. There's going to be a new documentary about these very interesting women. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds too much here, but in the 1870s, the National decided to try a bold new departure. To just show up and demand to vote. In the early 70s, hundreds of women claimed the right to vote based on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and they tried to register and vote, but most were turned away. And you'd be interested to know that in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, a group of 42 women made their way through a heavy snowstorm to cast their votes, led by the then quite elderly Grimke sisters. In 1872, Anthony managed to cast a vote in Rochester, New York, hoping to be arrested and then test this new strategy in the courts. She was arrested and indicted for, quote, knowingly, wrongfully, and unlawfully voting for a representative to the Congress of the United States, unquote. Found guilty and fired, Anthony insisted she would never pay $1 of it. To Anthony's great disappointment, her case did not proceed to the Supreme Court because some well-wisher who didn't want to see her jailed paid the fine for her without her permission, and she was very disappointed. So you may have seen that during the summer, as part of the centennial celebration and the campaign, that President Trump issued a pardon to Susan B. Anthony for this past event. And since, as we're hearing on the news constantly now, accepting a pardon is an admission of wrongdoing, I am sure that Susan B. Anthony would not have been pleased. Now, in another case, very important one, a suffragist, Virginia Minor of St. Louis, Missouri, together with her very supportive husband, Francis, managed to get this issue before the Supreme Court in 1874. She was claiming that the 14th Amendment, not that second enforcement clause with the word male in it, but the first part of it that's so important for so much of jurisprudence in this country, she claimed that 14th Amendment protected the voting rights of citizens, and women were citizens. But the court ruled unanimously that citizenship did not automatically confer the right to vote, and the 14th Amendment did not prevent any state from enfranchising women. So the suffragists then decided to go after their own constitutional amendment, worded similarly to the 15th, that specifically enfranchised women, protected them against discrimination by the states. And they hoped that it would become the next amendment, the 16th, but they got almost no support. So as a result of this decision, it was clear that there wasn't going to be a quick solution to gaining the vote for women. They were realizing that they were going to have to work super hard to go to every state and try to build public support to get the states to enfranchise them. And they were able to convince a lot of states to do so, but many of them refused. And that meant that women had to do this enormous amount of work with the final goal to get enough states so that the congressmen from those states were dependent on women constituents and would surely vote for the federal amendment, which would then go to the states and have support in the required 3/4 of the states. And therefore, I might add, that the effort to get woman suffrage in the United States, which was coincident with the effort to get the vote in many European countries and in former British colonies abroad, most of them got the vote far before we did, because we have this complicated federal system. And so, as you see here, women had to go through quite a lot for quite a long time. In fact, it would take another half a century. And later in 1920, they added it all up and found that between the Civil War and the victory of the 19th Amendment, they had been forced to conduct just hundreds of campaigns. Now, again, why was getting an amendment so difficult? The Founding Fathers deliberately made it difficult. They wanted the Constitution to be a flexible document for additions to be possible, and it was also their intention to prevent any revisions or additions that were whimsical or faddish, that lacked strong support from every part of the nation. And that's why they set it up this way, that to succeed, an amendment had to have the approval of 2/3 of each House of Congress and then 3/4 of the states. And as it turned out, there was a clear regional pattern to the success of the woman suffrage movement. That's what I'd like to talk about a bit now. It started in the Northeast, as we said, but its first successes came in the West. And its biggest problems, as we shall discuss, were in the South. In the 1800s, only 4 states adopted woman suffrage, starting with Wyoming, which did so in 1869 while still a territory. Utah followed a year later, as again a territory, adopting it in 1870. In both cases, politicians in these states saw woman suffrage as advantageous. In Wyoming, very sparsely populated, it was an effort to attract more settlers, almost a marketing device to bring attention to the territory. And in Utah, Mormon leaders hoped to convince Congress that it was okay to continue to practice polygamy, to show that Mormon women were just an oppressed lot. And they hoped to gain advantage also in their ongoing power struggle with non-Mormons who tended not to have so many women with them. Colorado and Idaho adopted woman suffrage also during the 19th century, as suffragists made alliances with the new movement for populism and other political efforts. Suffragists were definitely learning that in order to win, they had to convince politicians not just of the justice of women's suffrage, but they had to convince politicians that it would benefit them or the people they represented in some way. In other words, that an expediency argument would always be necessary. Later, after 1910, the next wave of victories, as you see on this map, would come from the West, beginning in 1910. But many states back east, and especially the South, were quite resistant. Most of the northeastern states would ratify, however, once it finally got through Congress and to them, but the South would prove to be the biggest problem for the women's movement. And in 1920, when ratification was put to the states, 9 of the 10 states that refused to ratify would be south of the Mason-Dixon line. After reuniting in 1890, putting aside, ending this schism, suffragists formed the National American Woman Suffrage Association in 1890. That would prove to be an enduring organization, the largest one, and they worked in the 1890s under Anthony's leadership. Her strategy, and the one they followed henceforth, was we're going to focus on just one goal. We're not going to be dealing with all these other issues, women's reform. We're going to focus on gaining the vote. If we have the vote, she reasoned, then we can pursue additional reforms. So to win, to get that broad national support, they made some concessions to the political realities of the United States during an era which was one of the worst in the whole history of American race relations. It was a period which white conservatives in the South were determined to reassert and then maintain white supremacy in politics. And they were actually using protection of white women as a rationalization for taking the vote away from black men, and not in the mood to listen to arguments for women's suffrage. The suffragist goal, as I said, was still a federal amendment. They knew they had to have some support from at least some southern states. As Laura Clay, an important leader from border states, told the national officers, you can work for 50 more years and get nowhere unless you bring in the South. I wrote a book about this, as Daniel mentioned earlier, New Women of the New South, about the leaders of the women's suffrage movement in the southern states, why they became suffragists despite all the pressure not to, and who they were, what kind of arguments they developed, etc. And again, the key issue was race. White Southern conservatives that were dominating the region already hated the suffrage movement, seeing it as a spinoff of the hated anti-slavery movement. By 1900, they regarded the 15th Amendment as unconstitutional. They insisted that Congress had violated the Constitution by forcing this on them during Reconstruction under gunpoint. They were trying to figure out how to keep men from voting, but without incurring the wrath of congressmen and those enforcement clauses being punished by reduced representation in Congress. So they came up, the white suffragists came up with a Southern strategy. They tried to convince these Southern lawmakers that not to take the vote away from black men and risk having their delegations cut back. Instead, they said, just adopt woman suffrage. Since there are more white women in the South than black, it will guarantee white supremacy. Southern suffragists actually deluded themselves into thinking that this might work, as did the national leaders who came to the South and were very active holding conventions down here, from which they barred black women and using these arguments. But it didn't work. As one white Mississippi politician said, Southern men refused to cower behind the petticoats and use lovely women to maintain white supremacy. Instead, we would stand by the polls with guns. But what they actually did was to adopt a number of requirements that you've heard of, including poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding tests, in which applicants were required to explain the meaning of part of the Constitution. And alas, Congress and the Supreme Court did not punish them or overrule these. They let them get away with it for another half century. For the rest of the suffrage movement, the South would continue to be a problem, and white suffragists would continue to make concessions to Southern racism. White suffragists distanced themselves from association with black suffragists and black suffrage. The interracial quality of the movement was lost. White suffragists were not all alike on race. Some were extreme racists who opposed blacks ever voting. Others saw literacy tests as okay since the nation had public schools and in time blacks would all learn to read. Others hated to compromise their values but did so anyway, knowing that during this period in American history, their movement was never going to succeed if suffrage leaders and organizations openly advocated for equal suffrage for African Americans. It was a strange parallel to what had happened after the Civil War, when supporters of African American suffrage believed they had no chance if woman suffrage was included. Before we move on, I want to say, however, that didn't mean that black women were not participating in the movement. They were. Despite their disappointment in white women, their fellow suffragist African American women saw this as their cause too. They continued to support the movement, mostly working through African American women's clubs and sometimes founding suffrage clubs of their own. Prominent African American suffragists included the legendary Ida B. Wells Barnett, who became internationally famous as a crusader against lynching. She was also one of the founders of the NAACP, founded a suffrage club in Chicago that became very influential in city politics. And Mary Church Terrell, the Oberlin-educated, cosmopolitan woman who was one of the founders and first president of the National Association of Colored Women. She was one of the few African-American women allowed to address the national organization conventions and even chosen to represent American women at international suffrage conferences in Europe, where she addressed audiences in fluent German and French. So what happened? How did this movement finally win? As the new century began, the movement seemed stalled. Anthony had retired and then died, a martyr to the cause. And the woman in charge for most of this period from 1904 to 1915 was a great, great orator, but not a particularly effective leader, and there were no state victories. But there was a new reform movement sweeping the nation, however, that was to have a major and positive impact on the women's suffrage movement and help it to win. It caused large numbers of women, especially in the growing women's club movement, to want the vote in order to gain reforms. It motivated male reformers and politicians who were progressives and wanted their help. And it provided the suffrage movement with a new and very powerful expediency argument. I'm speaking, of course, of the progressive movement. By 1910, this new reform movement had spread from the grassroots level, swept through both national parties, and contributed enormously to the cause of women's suffrage. We associate it most with Theodore Roosevelt, Republican, and Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Progressives in both parties wanted to move away from laissez-faire to see stronger, honest government that would act boldly to address major problems. They supported reforms to clean up city, state, and national politics and to protect the health and safety of the citizens. All over the U.S., including the South, the woman suffrage movement drew support from men and women who supported progressive reforms, including such things as abolishing child labor, protecting women workers, adopting public health programs, and legislation to curb political corruption. In fact, large corporations, party bosses, etc., who relied on corrupting politicians for their success, were terrified that women would clean up politics if allowed to enter this bachelor's club of politics. One thing that was remarkable was that the goals of the progressive movement fit perfectly with the prevailing ideas about woman's nature. Though by this time more women had advanced education and worked outside the home, most women did not. And ideas about woman's nature remained surprisingly the same as they had been throughout the 19th century. Progressives believed, like other people, that women tended to be more nurturing, compassionate, and honest. And they believed that they would, if given the vote, would vote for a stronger, more compassionate government that would enact progressive reforms. In fact, I argue in my book, One Woman Would Vote, that women eventually won the vote, not so much because people's ideas about woman's nature had changed, but that Americans had changed their ideas about the nature and purpose of government, wanting the government to be protective, compassionate, and moral. Beginning in 1910, at the height of the progressive movement, the women's movement began to really take off. And there were this new set of Western victories that seemed to breathe new life into suffragists all over the nation. They still faced tough battles in the Northeast, including New York and New Jersey, and most suffrage leaders believed they had still not reached that magic turning point where they had won enough states to assure a victory in Congress. But some suffragists started to get impatient, saying, let's drop all this state work and just focus on Congress, on getting that national amendment. And this was the point of view of a young woman named Alice Paul, who soon emerged as a leader of the so-called militant suffragists of the United States and is one of the best-known suffrage leaders. She came back to the United States in 1910 after studying as a political science student in London. She had met and admired the militant wing of the suffrage movement there, who were called the suffragettes. The real name was the Women's Social and Political Union. By the way, in the United States, suffragists did not call themselves suffragettes. It was only used by anti-suffragists to belittle and demean them. It was started out that way in Britain also, but there the more militant suffragists adopted that term and turned it on its head and called themselves suffragettes. But that was not the case in the United States, and therefore all of you, when you're speaking of this, please avoid calling them suffragettes because you are calling them something they hated to be called because it was only used to belittle them, to dismiss them as childish and selfish women who didn't know what they were doing. So anyway, Paul was very impressed with them, brought back their tactics to the U.S. Paul first worked within the National American Woman Suffrage Association, including organizing this famous parade in Washington, D.C. on the eve of Wilson's inauguration in 1913. Around 8,000 peaceful demonstrators wearing outfits representing their group or wearing white took part. And here you see, first on the left, the actual photo, and then this great scene in a TV program, Iron-Jawed Angels, HBO produced, a great film that's out there on Netflix that you can watch while you're during the shutdown. It's called, again, Iron-Jawed Angels, with Hilary Swank starring as Alice Paul, and it's terrific. Unfortunately, men in the crowd, many of them drunk and hostile to the suffragists, attacked the marchers. But to Paul's delight, this led to increased sympathy for the movement, especially with members of Congress whose wives and daughters and sisters and mothers were among the marchers. By 1914, different approaches to seeking suffrage led to another schism in the suffrage ranks as the militants departed from the National American Woman Suffrage Association and founded separately the National Woman's Party, a much smaller group that had large numbers of young, professional, college-educated, well-off to the most extent women, with some also some older senior women who were very wealthy, who were also militant in spirit and broke off and joined them. So it infuriated suffragists in the National when the National Woman's Party picketed the White House, something that was shocking in those days and certainly shocking when done by women. But the most shocking thing that the militants did was to picket the White House even after the United States entered World War I. And it was a time that there was a great crackdown in any opposition, and criticism of the president and the government was simply not tolerated. You could be thrown in jail for that. And Wilson spoke of the war as a war to promote democracy, and so they tried to embarrass him before the world. And you see here the most inflammatory act, calling him Kaiser Wilson. The Wilson administration did eventually jail them, sending them to jail under harsh conditions, many of them with long sentences, and some of them demanded to be treated as political prisoners. Some of them, including Alice Paul, went on hunger strikes and were forcibly fed, which was a horrible procedure done by shoving a feeding tube through a nostril or down your throat, and then pouring soup or raw eggs into them, often causing bleeding, as you can imagine, and nausea. Now, back to South Carolina, once again, a Charlestonian, a South Carolinian named Anita Politzer played a key role in the suffrage movement. She was actually one of Alice Paul's key associates, a young woman very active in the National Woman's Party near the end of the suffrage struggle, and then continued to be active years later when the National Woman's Party initiated the Equal Rights Amendment proposal, and she continued to work for that. When the prisoners were released, Anita Politzer was the person who organized a national tour featuring the suffrage prisoners wearing prison uniform replicas. It was called the Prison Special. First stop, Charleston, South Carolina. Attractive, confident, and able to use her Southern charm very effectively, Anita Politzer was often sent when there was someone that needed to be persuaded. Anita, by the way, was one of three Politzer sisters. Anita, Carrie, and Mabel Politzer were suffragists. The other two, older than she, were working within the state, and they worked individually and together in support of a wide range of women's issues. And again, in South Carolina Women, Their Lives and Time, there's a wonderful article on Anita by Amy McCandless of College of Charleston that some of you may know. And again, their home is still there and on Pitt Street in downtown Charleston. Here's a picture of Carrie Politzer as a suffragist. Meanwhile, another Carrie Chapman, Catt, was the leader of the massive National American Woman Suffrage Association and steered it to the final victory. Having returned to the national presidency in 1915, the skillful general of the movement immediately launched what she called the winning plan, coordinating efforts across the nation and running a massive lobbying effort to enlist congressional support. To gain favor with President Wilson and the public, rather than picketing the White House, Catt put aside her own pacifism, by the way, and urged suffragists to throw themselves as visibly as possible into war work. The National American Woman Suffrage Association even funded an overseas hospital in France, and you see here the first contingent of nurses who worked there in the line of fire. Finally, they persuaded Wilson to endorse the federal amendment, a huge victory, In 1918, he addressed Congress, asking them to enfranchise women in recognition of their war service. But they still had to win over a few more senators who would not budge, and a lot of them Southerners, and trying to get these people replaced and elect friends over enemies in the upcoming November election was very tough because a pandemic struck of 1918. And again, it was horrific. Far more people died than in World War I. More people than have died so far in this horrible one we now face. And like today, public health officials banned large gatherings of people. Suffragists were greatly limited in their campaigning, had to resort to new ways of doing things. But luckily, in the November elections, they did manage to defeat a few congressional enemies and elect a few friends, making the victory possible. And in June of 1919, Congress, now both houses, had approved the amendment by the required two-thirds vote, and the amendment was sent to the states for ratification. As this final struggle began, which lasted about a year and a half, Illinois and Wisconsin were competing for the honor of being the first to ratify, while Georgia and Alabama scrambled to be the first to pass a rejection resolution denouncing the Susan B. Anthony Amendment as unwarranted, unnecessary, and downright dangerous. That's Anita Politzer in this picture, third from the right. Invoking their Confederate ancestors who had fought to the last ditch against the Yankees, many Southern legislators vowed to fight till the end against this incursion into the rights of the states, insisting, along with these anti-suffrage women who put out this pamphlet, that approval of the 19th century would actually show it would represent consent to the 15th, and that no true son or daughter of the South could possibly do that. Only these foolish suffragettes who were so ungrateful for male leadership and protection. When Mississippi voted against the ratification of the amendment, the Jackson newspaper celebrated the defeat, proclaiming, and I quote, "This vile old thing is as dead as its author, Susan B. Anthony, that old advocate of social equality and intermarriage of the races, and Mississippi will never be annoyed by it again," unquote. South Carolina did not ratify, despite the best efforts of suffragists in the state. And again, you can read about them in a great article by Jim Farmer in South Carolina Women, Their Lives and Times. Eulalie Salley of Aiken was the primary leader of the South Carolina Equal Suffrage League, an affiliate with the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And interestingly, Salley got interested in women's rights, like a lot of other women in the state, because of a court case involving Lucy Dugas Tillman, the wife of Benjamin Tillman, Jr., whose husband had her two daughters deeded away to his mother and father while Lucy was ill. You could do that in those days, and that horrified South Carolina women, leading them to realize inequities that still existed, and it was a major court case that went all the way to the South Carolina Supreme Court, in which Lucy got custody of her children over the senator. Salley was an aggressive and innovative suffrage campaigner, traveling on unpaved county roads to canvass door to door, staging a myriad of fundraisers. She once took part in boxing lessons and then performed in a prize fight. She rode in an airplane with a pilot flying low over the cities, dropping suffrage pamphlets. And some people, including her husband, regarded her actions as scandalous and embarrassing. So to fund her suffrage work, she applied for and received a real estate license in 1915, and in fact became the first woman realtor in the state, and launched a very successful career helping put Aiken on the map and building up the Myrtle Beach area. She became quite a legend. Salley knew and greatly admired Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw, strongly disapproved of the unladylike militant wing of the movement. In 1919, she became the president of the South Carolina Suffragists, and then after the victory, she became a leader in the League of Women Voters and worked at ending further discrimination against women. And by the way, South Carolina did not formally ratify until 1969, one of the last to do so. And when that happened, she was invited to stand behind the governor, there she is in the hat, when he finally signed the 19th Amendment into law, whereupon she says to them, she scolded them for the delay and said, "Boys, I've been waiting 50 years to tell you just what I think of you." Returning to 1920 and the ratification fight, by the summer of 1920, only one more state was needed. No legislatures would be in session. President Wilson, eager for Democrats to be on the right side of the issue, pressured Democratic governors to call special sessions, and Governor Roberts of Tennessee complied. And therefore, the final battle over women's suffrage took place in Nashville in the long, hot summer of 1920. In that final dramatic contest, anti-suffragists as well as suffragists from all over the nations descended upon the state in a bitter struggle over ideology and influence. Alice Paul wisely stayed away, but she sent lieutenants, including Anita Politzer, seen here in Nashville lobbying state legislators. Politzer went all over the state seeking to find and persuade legislators to vote for enfranchisement. Catt was in Nashville, having come to aid the battle that she hoped would win this issue and resolve it once and for all. At first, it seemed they had all the support they needed, but as she warned the local suffragists, many of the men who had promised to support would drop one by one under pressure from the liquor and the railroad industries or the cotton textile barons. And so they watched with dismay as this happened, many of the legislators switching sides, and they were quite uncertain of the result when the final vote took place. But finally, on August the 18th, Tennessee ratified. The result of this 24-year-old legislator from the mountains, Harry Byrne, changing his vote at the insistence of his elderly mother. A great story. A statue of them both, mother and son, was erected in Tennessee this summer, and we made a documentary called By One Vote that if you'd like to see about the woman suffrage movement in the South, you can Google it, By One Vote, look under Nashville Public Television, click on it, and watch it. Politzer family lore said that it was Anita, not the mother, who persuaded Harry, having had dinner with him the night before, but most people think it was the mother. The vote took place on August 18th, but the antis even then didn't give up. Using parliamentary tricks, they called for a revote. Then some left the state to keep that from happening, and no quorum. Supporters finally managed to meet and affirm the vote. The amendment was rushed to D.C., where the Secretary of State was gotten up in the middle of the night so he could sign it before the antis could do anything, get an injunction or otherwise stop it. And so finally, on August 26, 1920, the federal amendment that the suffragists had fought for so long became officially the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. The adoption of the 19th Amendment was not a complete victory, however, as many women would not be allowed to use that new right. To be clear, all American women who were citizens were enfranchised by the 19th Amendment. Some people are saying that African American women were not, but that's not true. They were. But many of them would not be allowed to claim that right. Outside the South, African American women were voting, but most black women still lived in the South, and they were prevented from voting by the same barriers that had been constructed to keep black men from voting, as you see here. A major goal of the civil rights movement of the 1960s was to remove those barriers. And again, many women and men, such as the great Fannie Lou Hamer of Mississippi, who testified that she hadn't even known she had the vote until she was in her 40s. She struggled against great odds, enduring jail, beatings, etc., to do so. The goal was largely accomplished through the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the most important acts of Congress in our history, and it finally enforced both the 15th and the 19th Amendments and drastically changed American politics. The Voting Rights Act banned election-related practices, including literacy tests that had been used to keep African American women and men from the polls, directing the Justice Department to monitor voting registration in counties where less than half of African American residents were registered, and requiring counties and states with a history of discrimination against African American enfranchisement to get advance approval or pre-clearance from the Department of Justice before they could adopt any new voting regulations. And it worked. The results were dramatic. By the end of the year, some 250,000 new Black voters were registered. Before the Voting Rights Act, an estimated 23% of African Americans of voting age could vote nationwide. But by 1969, 61% had registered, and the numbers kept climbing. Over time, African American women would prove to be the nation's most devoted voters, today turning out in large percentages at every election. Unfortunately, in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled a key part of that act was unconstitutional in Shelby County versus Holder. The justices assumed that in the age of Obama, when Americans had elected an African American as president, that federal protection of minority voting rights was no longer needed. This was a huge mistake, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg realized, and in her dissent she wrote that weakening the essential part of the Voting Rights Act, removing that pre-clearance part, when it had worked so well to stop discrimination, was, quote, like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet, unquote. In many states, serious voter suppression began almost immediately. There were problems, as you well know, with voter suppression during this election, and increased calls for renewal of the Voting Rights Act, perhaps named, and I think would be a great idea, for the late John Lewis. It seems as though voting rights are something that are very difficult to gain, and then once gained, must be protected and defended. It seems like the suffrage movement is really never over. But at last this lecture is, and I am eager to hear your thoughts and questions. As I close, let me return to August 26, 1920, the day the 19th Amendment was victorious. In the prepared message Catt delivered that day, rather than thanking the President, members of Congress, state legislators, the National American Woman Suffrage Association president directed her remarks to the women of America, reminding them of the 72 years of struggle by generations of suffragists and the many sacrifices made so that, quote, you and your daughters might inherit political freedom, unquote. Quote, that vote has been costly, she said. Prize it.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. That was wonderful, and such a detailed history that connected the overall suffrage movement 100 years ago. In 1920, it's, I guess, sort of the official victory, but as you noted, the victory, it's not over. It's an ongoing struggle, and it's not a clear victory. It was a gain, certainly, and something to be celebrated, but there's still, it's something that needs to be protected constantly, and they're always.
It's important to recognize that even though African American women in the South were deprived of using that right by the Southern state legislators, they still now had that right, which they had not gotten under the 15th Amendment, bear in mind. And so in 1965, when the Voting Rights Amendment was victorious, what it did was to get the federal government to enforce the 15th and the 19th, you see. So it was super important as even for that group that was denied initially the right to use it. It was the foundation for their success in 1965. So the 19th Amendment was hugely important for all women, and definitely something to be celebrated, in my opinion.
Yes. So certainly something to be celebrated, and 100 years ago, although it took South Carolina a little bit longer to ratify, about almost 50
You're
years.
rid of Mississippi, though, so.
Yeah, we beat out Mississippi, but still, and you talked about the South and South Carolina and that lag, a little bit of a lag there, but really interesting, how things came around. And one thing I was going to ask you to just say a little bit more about, but you made that argument, and it's in your book, New Women of the New South. But could you say a little bit more about how your argument, what you were arguing, is that it was less that the women's movement suddenly convinced everyone that their way was right and women should have the vote after so many years of trying and making the arguments, so many campaigns, but it was rather that there was an attitude change towards the nature of government, that people became started to see government as more progressive, compassionate, protective. How could you say a little bit more about that really intriguing argument?
Yeah, most people know that in U.S. history that during the 19th century, the attitude of the federal government was rather what we call laissez-faire, hands-off. It was like, let the market run, and don't interfere. Also, there was this what we call social Darwinism, this idea that society and the development of human beings, like nature, is sink or swim with the survival of the fittest, and that for the government to get involved in such things as public health or public housing, that was interference in the struggle that nature and they presumed that God also was directing it, and therefore the best people were the richest people, that sort of thing. The richest people like to think that. So at that point, in Britain and in the United States, some of the people who were against women's suffrage would say things like, oh, if women had the vote, they'd be too deferential to autocrats, and they'd be too compassionate, and they'd do things like vote for public housing or public health or whatever. We can't have that. They'd be too easily swayed. They're weak, that kind of thing. Okay, so that gives you the idea of how different it was when the progressive movement comes along and rejects that kind of thinking and calls for an activist, positive government that will try to do away with corruption in government and to represent the needs of the people rather than the big corporations, to start having income tax for the first time, and not just income tax, but a progressive income tax. And in fact, one of there were 4 major amendments to the Constitution that came as a result of the progressive movement. One was the income tax, and to fund all of these programs that now wanted direct election of senators rather than state legislators electing them, woman suffrage, and prohibition, which didn't last long, but was adopted then. All part of the goals of many of the progressives.
Interesting. Yeah. Would you see any parallels to today from 100 years? Would you connect that to the political climate today at all, or is that too much of a stretch with the...
Well, we do have at this moment a sentiment on the part of many people, and not only the left of the Democratic Party that's adopted the term progressive, but by the center and the left in this country, that sees a need for the government to become more active in response to all kinds of pent-up social programs, things in the country that have not gotten attention or money from the federal government for a long time because of this anti-government feeling that really was initiated around 1980, and the idea that the government is the problem more than the solution. And as a result, we have a crumbling infrastructure, which is just the most obvious part of the pent-up problems that haven't been addressed that need to be addressed. And we don't do nearly enough in terms of public education. Never mind the whole issue of public health, which is much on our minds these days. So I think in that regard that there definitely are some comparisons, in my opinion, in terms of the political situation, whether or not our country will rally around and support more activist government. I don't know. Unfortunately, there's a tendency by many to see activist government as a negative thing called socialism, though that's not the way I see it at all. I think it means that it's government by the people, for the people, and that we should get on with it. Yeah. Just my opinion, anyway.
Yeah. Well, you brought up a number of really interesting characters. I think a lot of folks had heard about the Grimke sisters from South Carolina, but some of these other folks like Anita Politzer and the Politzer sisters and Miss Salley, just it sounds like you could make movies out of these folks as well. They're just, I mean, really powerful figures.
They are.
Yeah, wonderful discoveries.
And I mentioned that South Carolina Educational Television and the great Beryl Dakers, they are working on this, and they're going to call it South Carolina Sisters. And it's a 3-part documentary, one on the Grimkes, one on the Rollins, and one on the Politzers. And, yeah. I don't think that Eulalie Salley is in this because the theme here is sisters.
Yes.
And that was a kind of a common thing in the South. Anna Howard Shaw, when she toured the South at one point, she was so struck by the fact that so many sisters, families of sisters, the Clay sisters, the Gordon sisters, and others were leading the movement down here, that she said, if there's a state in the South that hasn't been organized, it must be because there's not a family of sisters that is there ready to do it, or something like that. So we picked up on that theme for this series. And again, it'll be coming out pretty soon, so watch for these on South Carolina ETV.
Yeah, we will definitely get our people on that. We'll send around a notice, because I think that it sounds like a fascinating topic. And did the sisters clearly supported each other? Did they those 3 pairs of South Carolina sisters? But did they have much family support beyond that? Were their families behind their politics, or were they sort of cast out?
It depended. I know that the Politzer sisters' mother was very supportive of this, saw to it that the girls got to go to the North to get very good college educations. I think the father had already died by the time the girls reached that age. And And the Grimke sisters, absolutely not, because, you know, they
Right.
broke with their family in the most extreme way possible. But something about them that I think is, but they did manage, however, to continue to have a close relationship by mail with their mother for many years. And one of their sisters had moved to Philadelphia, and when Angelina married a fiery abolitionist named Theodore Weld and had a wedding in which an African American performed the wedding, and the guests were both white and black. Their sister allowed them to have that in her parlor. So I should say that, yes, there was some. But one of the most striking things was that after the Civil War, Angelina read in the newspapers about two young men with the last name Grimke who were African American. And the name is so unusual that she wrote to them and said, I saw this, by any chance, is there a connection? And they wrote back and said, yes, ma'am, your brother is our father. And the brother had died by this time. And she welcomed them into her family, put them through college, and two of those young men became two of the leading black professionals and intellectuals in this country. And one of them, it was one of the founders of the NAACP. So that's family. It's a different kind of family story than you're used to hearing, but very much the story of family and family members at last supporting one another.
Yeah, and you talked about that, both the overlaps, the interweaving of the cross racial connections that happened when the abolitionist movement and the suffrage movement worked together, but also sometimes when they split apart. And you know, they were, and so those were interesting connections, but also divisions sometimes.
Yeah, it's all very complicated. It's a story of inspiring interracial relationships and of betrayal and disappointment. All of that is part of this. For example, Susan B. Anthony was furious with Frederick Douglass because of the Negroes' Hour. He later on, when the tide had turned and they were holding a national conference in Atlanta in 1895 to try to win over the South, she asked him not to come. He died not much longer after that, and she was invited to give the eulogy at his funeral. You know, these very complicated relationships that went on, and it was a period that the great historian Rayford Logan referred to as the nadir of race relations in America. We've always had problems with race relations. This period between around the end of Reconstruction and 1920 seemed to be even worse. The period of when disfranchisement took place, when Jim Crow laws were established, when lynchings reached an all-time high because of the fact that the white population was trying to terrorize the black population into not protesting their disfranchisement and segregation. And it was the beginning of efforts such as the NAACP, which, by the way, was founded by an interracial group of reformers, many of them suffrage supporters, you know, the beginning of the great pushback that continued all the way through to the realization of those civil rights acts of 64 and 65, and continues still. Yeah.
It's always a complex story when you're talking about that's the South, that's Southern history. It's never a simple story, and when you bring in race and gender, it gets all mixed up. So that's
maybe I could take the opportunity to endorse a couple more books, not by me. Claudia Smith Brinson, a longtime journalist in this state, has just come out with a wonderful new book called South Carolina Stories. I can't remember exactly the title of it. But I listened last night to a program like this in which she was presenting along with Judge Richard Gergel, who has that incredible book that came out last year called Unexampled Courage, the story of the blinding of Isaac Woodard and the awakening of President Harry Truman and Judge Wadis Waring. And so those of you who either spent all your life in South Carolina or maybe just moved here and want to know a lot more about it, I would really recommend that you look at those books, which are wonderful. There's going to be a documentary on PBS American Experience about Richard Gergel's book before too long. They're working on that. And also, I would urge you to look, to get, maybe you could send them the information about the 3-volume book, South Carolina Lives and Times. See, I always put all these notes in them because I'm always using them. This is Elizabeth Wright, who was the founder of Voorhees University, and there's a story in there about her going door to door throughout the Black community trying to raise funds for the building of that school. I can't reach right now my volume 1, but the volume 1 is a picture of an Indian chieftain who was the lady of the Cafetachequi, which she was the head of the Indian tribe that occupied central South Carolina around where Camden is when DeSoto and his group first came through here in the late 1500s. So on the cover of the first volume is the Lady of the Cafetachequi, which is what the Spanish called her. And then on the cover of the final volume is former Supreme Court Chief Justice Jean Toll, who was headed up the ERA effort in the legislature as a state legislator, has been worked for women's rights in the state, and ended up being the Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court. So, and in between, just all these stories of women in South Carolina, and always told in a lives and times approach, so that you don't just find out about that individual, but about the times in which they lived. And so if you look at all 3 of them, they're all in paperback and very affordable, and be a good read for people who are wanting to learn the state. And I, by the way, I co-edited this with Dr. Valinda Littlefield, who was a professor at the University of South Carolina in history and African American studies, and Joan Marie Johnson, who is a scholar in Illinois, but married to Don Johnson, who was from Columbia, and she developed this huge interest in the state. So,
well, we can always stand some more reading recommendations. So we have a wonderful audience of readers out there who love history and love learning about the history of this state of South Carolina. So that is perfect, and that'll be right up our alley. So thank you for that. And I know
maybe when after the shutdown and after we're all happily vaccinated and life starts to get back to normal, I can come up and talk to you about my new book called Divided We Stand, The Battle Over Women's Rights and Family Values That Polarized American Politics, which is all about the 1970s and the rise of the women's rights movement, the rise of a conservative women's rights movement in opposition, and how that affected the political parties and our political culture. So you see, I moved back and forth between the progressive era and the modern era in my scholarship.
Yeah, well, that sounds perfect. We'll make it a date. That would be wonderful.
Okay.
And yeah, so we'll do that, and we'll look forward to that happening and happening in person as well. We'll look forward to that because hopefully, you know, I keep up whenever I need a boost. You know, get ready for the holidays, whatever holidays coming up next, and I look up the vaccine updates as well, you know, with fingers crossed. So hopefully we'll get some good news, and we'd love to have you. You know, it's not too far a trip up from Folly Beach up here. We'd love to have you in person, and those folks, Claudia Smith Brinson I'm on the South Carolina Academy of Authors board, and she's on there, and Val Littlefield, who you mentioned, your co-editor, is on there, and they're wonderful people, and maybe we could even do a panel discussion with the three of y'all. That'd be, I'm sure we would pack the house with the three of y'all, because that's quite a group. So thank you so much for spending time with us today. If folks miss this morning, they can see this on our YouTube channel, the Georgetown County Library YouTube channel. Heather Pelham, who runs our video, does a wonderful job editing this and putting it up there. So we thank Heather so much for doing that. And also Truman Wins, who is our IT specialist and does
super helpful.
He is unbelievably helpful and knowledgeable. So we're grateful to both Heather and Truman for all they do to make us look good, make me look as good as I can possibly look here. You do a good job making yourself look good, Marjorie, with all your scholarship and knowledge, and we really appreciate you being here with us.
The green screen that my husband gave me for my birthday.
Yeah, it looks wonderful as well, and maybe we can get Don Doyle up here as well to give a talk, because he's
just
terrific
finished.
as well.
He's finishing right now writing a book that he's done during the Great Shutdown about the period right after the Civil War and how the United States inspired the rise of democracy in other parts of the world.
Well,
during Reconstruction. So.
The good news about this whole situation is that it has given plenty of time to read and to write. So y'all are staying productive, which is great. So that's the good news. And again, one woman, one vote. Folks, Marjorie does have copies. If you want a copy, you can get in touch with me, and I can get you in touch with Marjorie. It's dturner@gtcounty.org, and that's Volume 1. Volume 2 will be out and orderable, and that is coming out in March. And we have a couple of holiday shows coming up on Tuesday, December 15th. At 10 a.m., Bob Willey will have Tuesdays With, and that is a Gullah Christmas. And then later on that same Tuesday, the 15th, we'll have Dr. Jill Trinka playing an assortment of instruments, and she'll be bringing us a Christmas concert, beautiful, wonderful Appalachian tunes and holiday favorites. So looking forward to that. And thank y'all for spending time with us on this Foul First Thursday with Dr. Marjorie Spruill, now a South Carolina treasure. So we're so pleased to have her. And thank you, Marjorie.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Have a great day.